Good afternoon, everybody. What an enormous honor and pleasure it is for me to be sharing a stage with Lindsey. Lindsey has an extraordinary ability to tell us stories of conflict with, I think, a unique balance between a dispassionate presence, which is necessary to do the journalistic work, and a deep human compassion. And it's very, very difficult and rare to see that combination sustained for so long in such a public job. She's been a crucial presence, I think, for so many of us in connecting us to events that concern us as human beings, and of course also in a globalized world affect us also very, very directly, economically, socially, geographically even. I wonder, is there anybody from Ukraine in the audience? I wonder. Well, if there isn't, I think most of us are living in and with and around people from Ukraine. It's a conflict which does not seem to be over there. I spent a lot of time in Ballivon, just across the bay, and the population of Ballivon doubled last year. And so half the settled population of Ballivon now is Ukrainian, and it's an extraordinary thing to be just walking along the pier, and the language you are most likely to hear now there is Ukrainian, and you hear voices on the phones from the front lines. You have mothers talking to their sons, you've women talking to their husbands and their brothers. So it does not seem far away, even if the geographical distance is there. But nonetheless, it's crucial for us to have a presence like Lindsey's, opening it up for us and telling us those stories. We might just start with storytelling in a way, and perhaps maybe your last visit, you did a number of extremely moving reports, and maybe you just might recall for us what stories did you find yourself telling this time?
Yeah, thank you, Fintan. Thank you all for coming, and Katrina as well. It's great to be in Galway. Yeah, it's so interesting what you say about Ukraine not being far away in that sense. And I think that that's one of the differences between reporting this war and many of the other conflicts that I've reported, which is both here and in the UK. People have that sense, because so many Ukrainians have come, and because of it being in Europe, and because of it having implications for NATO, it does feel that much closer. And so last year, I spent about 6 months of the year in Ukraine last year, and this year I spent about 2 months in two separate trips. And I try and spend as much time in the east and the south as possible, which is sort of more on the front line and less in Kyiv. And so it's much more the fighters and the people in the front line areas rather than the politicians and so on. And I think it's one thing. So last time was the beginning of the counteroffensive, which I think all of us are aware is going much more slowly than certainly the Ukrainian government had hoped. And we went to the first village, which was taken by the Ukrainians, which was a place called Blaudatne. This is a tiny village, And when we got there, I did two trips there actually. One was with the National Guard, and the other was with the Special Forces, Ukrainian Special Forces. And they'd taken it, but the sound of war, the sound of artillery was really loud, outgoing, luckily. So, it really wasn't far away at all. And you realized how tentative these gains were. And we went around the village, and I thought, what was it like to live in this village when it was under Russian occupation, which it had been for the last, I don't know how many months. There was somebody's farmhouse which had a dog kennel, and they'd stored their rockets in the dog kennel. I mean, I don't know where else you'd put them. I guess that's all right. And but the other thing was the drones overhead the whole time. Now, half the time I couldn't really hear them, but the soldiers we were with, they can hear them the whole time. They're like, right, move along, get in, don't stay out. And you realize it just wasn't safe to be outside much, because these drones are overhead the whole time. And most of those drones are recce drones, which can see you there, and then they may call in artillery or whatever. Very few of them are the kind of drones that actually drop bombs. They do that elsewhere. But so you had that sense of jeopardy all the time. And this sense that these gains, I think they took 7 villages in that first week, and that it had been really hard fighting. And what the Russians have put together a particular unit for the counter-offensive to counter the counter-offensive, which I keep calling Generation Z. It's not called Generation Z, it's called Z something else. And many of whom are convicts, like the Wagner group, so these are not the nicest of guys, but they're tough, and they'll fight, and they are fighting. And so I think we got a real sense how difficult this was going to be. Now, one of the secrets that the Ukrainians keep is they will never talk about how many casualties there are. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's mainly to do with morale, and also to do with not wanting, the enemy to know what's going on. But you can't miss it, because every town you go through, and there's a lot of driving in Ukraine, it's a huge country, every town you go through has a cemetery, and you see the newly erected flags, the yellow and the blue. And these are the soldiers of that village who've been killed. And we did a very basic journalistic thing. We stopped in a village, and we went to the cemetery, and we took down the names of the soldiers whose graves we could see. I think there were 5 in that particular village, and then we, asked people around where the families were. And the mothers, they want to talk because they're proud of their sons. They're not disillusioned with the war. They absolutely believe that this war has to be fought. But my God, the cost is just extraordinary. And I really felt it doing that piece, which we did from 2 cemeteries. The sound of a mother weeping over the grave of her son. Ooh, it's the kind of thing that goes through you, and you don't forget it.
Yeah, and extremely effective television. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but
no, that's my job.
And the simplicity of it, the directness of it, that connection being made for people, I think is what's so crucial. But I wanted to ask you about, and you've already kind of mentioned this in a way, but this tension between, you're there in a way on sufferance of the Ukrainian government. You need the cooperation of the armed forces. That's why you're there. And as you were saying when we were talking before, of course, you couldn't do this in Russia. So we have to remember that.
And just to say about the mothers, because that's a really important thing, the Ukrainian government doesn't want to dwell on the casualties. But of course, in Russia, you can't tell that story at all. You can't go to a cemetery in Russia and tell the story of the dead soldiers. But my God, the Russian mothers, just like the Ukrainian mothers, and there are more of them. And of course, we think about the wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya, which the Russians fought. It was the mothers of the soldiers who had a huge part in bringing an end to those wars because they could take it no longer. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, from what I understand. But what do I know? Because we're not there. And it's one of the major frustrations of this war, that we can really only tell it from the one side. And there are foreign correspondents, Steve Rosenberg of the BBC, Diana Magnay of Sky, they're fantastic reporters. But, Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal, brilliant journalist, arrested and in prison for we don't know how long. So, reporting from Russia is very, very difficult.
And I wondered about the tension between obviously working with the government, working with the armed forces on the one side, and yet what you do so superbly and always do, and it's the moral center of your work, is to report the cost.
It's really hard, and up till now, I think that it's been quite easy, compared to other stories that I've covered or conflicts that I've covered. Access in Ukraine has been much easier, and it's also, I think it's the first time in my life where it's good to be British. Because normally in the kind of places I go, it's like I'm a representative of evil colonialists. Not this time. Now I'm a representative of Boris Johnson. And so you're constantly getting people saying, Boris Johnson, we love him. And I'm like, please have him. Be my guest. We've got rid of him, so you have him. The other thing which, at the beginning of the war, it was quite interesting because the guys on the checkpoints, the checkpoints always spring up during a war. And checkpoints are a weird thing because in some places they're, the most terrifying thing you've ever been through. In the DRC, what was Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, I could think of checkpoints there, which are, drunken, red-eyed guys with machetes, and you're like, oh, it's the most terrifying thing. In other places, they just want to waste your time because it's the first time they've ever worn a uniform. And in Ukraine, it was like, ooh, what's that weird woman with the gray hair doing in the back of the car? And so Maxime, who is our local producer, would be having these long conversations which I didn't quite understand. And then eventually I said, well, what's going on, Max? What are you saying? And he says, okay, they have lots of questions. And he says, I have 3 answers, and they always work. I say, okay, what are they? And he says, the first thing I say is, she's a very famous journalist. And then the second thing I say is, she knows the Queen personally. Which, of course, now has to be put in the past tense. And if that didn't work, the last one, for some reason, which always worked, he said, was, she saw Gaddafi's body with her own eyes. I have no idea why it works, but it works.
What is your sense of the cost to Ukraine? Because as you said, there's, for very understandable reasons, everybody does it in war anyway, and particularly when you've been invaded and you have to sustain an idea of the war as a great patriotic crusade, and you have to retain Western support, and people want stories about victory. What's your sense of the underlying devastation? Could you just give us a sense of it physically and in human terms?
Well, there are lots of different layers to this. I mean, the first layer is the physical devastation of the villages in eastern Ukraine. Now, obviously that's since 2014, and I was in Crimea in eastern Ukraine in 2014 when the Russians first invaded. And I think that's one of the things which Ukrainians always remind you. We talk about this war having started last year. It started in 2014, and it has continued since then because those areas have been occupied since then. But oh my God, the devastation of the villages. I have rarely seen anything where you drive mile after mile after mile, and there is not a house standing, and where the onion dome of the church is just lying in the mud. And there may be people living there in the crypt. Came across one place like that, where the onion dome is lying in the mud, and then in the crypt underneath the church, there were, I think, 6 families living. And so that is the most extraordinary devastation. And now we're learning more and more about the landmines. So obviously when you go in, as I've done, to these newly liberated villages, as the Ukrainians call them, they're always very careful because they say, places may be booby-trapped or mined, and there's often those symbols of mines, and they're starting to demine. But now, what has happened in the last few months is that the Russians have seeded the whole area with mines to stop the counteroffensive, and it's very effective. Because the Ukrainians had hoped that they would be able to, use all these shiny new tanks, the Leopards and the Challengers, which they've got to, drive across and, take that territory. They are now going by foot. They're going by foot to get rid of landmines. Now, imagine how painstaking that is. We're talking about a massive country. And now the Americans have given the Ukrainians cluster munitions. I understand why they've done it. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The world is not making enough ammunition for this war. Just think about that for a minute. The world is not making enough ammunition for this war. And what the Americans had a lot left over of was cluster munitions. So that's what they've given them, and the Ukrainians want them. But that is storing up so many problems for the future. So this whole area of east and southern Ukraine is going to be infested with landmines for centuries. So, what is it from Tacitus? They made a desolation and called it peace. Yeah. When you get to the end of this, is this land going to be inhabitable, all of eastern Ukraine? At the moment, I can't see that it is. And so that's the sort of underlying cost of war, quite apart from, the financial costs at the moment that, they can't export the grain. You will all have seen the stories of the last few days about the Russians pulling out of the grain deal. I mean, everything that the Ukrainian economy was based on. But the one thing which is like a reverse cost, which I find fascinating, is the cultural side. So if you think of Ukrainians, and I'm sorry we don't have any in the audience because I always find it very interesting talking to Ukrainians about this, that they were colonized by Russia in, Potemkin, Catherine the Great, all of that stuff from the 1780s and so on. And then the Soviet Union was a form of colonization as well. And they see this very much as the colonizer coming back to recolonize. And the cultural response to that is this massive surge of pride in Ukrainian history and culture. So whether it's, the wearing of embroidered shirts, there's quite a lot of that, or, the national poet, Taras Shevchenko, I mean, his statue is in every town, and you can always recognize him because he has the world's best mustache. And an absolute flowering of literature and poetry and painting and video installations and, incredible surge of pride in Ukrainian identity and a sense of what it is to be Ukrainian. And in some ways, that's part of the fight back. It's quite important.
One of the things that's somewhat mysterious, at least to me, is that Russia is a nation whose identity has been forged in war and in resistance to invasion.
Yeah.
You don't need to know very much about its history to know that the enormous psychological place of the Napoleonic invasion and then, of course, Hitler's invasion. Yeah. And you would think that a culture which has itself been formed in that way would have an instinctive understanding of the fact that actually if you invade somebody else, you're not obliterating their nationality, you're creating this new arena in which it's going to be forged.
But you see, that's not how it's done, is it? Because the sense of history, and this again I find fascinating, is this powerful use of history, the rewriting of history. So the Ukrainians are rewriting history, which make them a lot more independent than they actually were. And the Russians are rewriting history as well. And particularly, this war started with Putin, who everybody thinks had far too much time on his hands during COVID, and therefore penned a 7,000-word historical essay, which was all about how Ukraine had never been a country, and they call the Second World War the Great Patriotic War, and how hard done by the Russians are, and how Europe has always been an enemy, and so on and so forth. And this rewriting of history has been very potent and very effective. And I think a lot of Russians accept that interpretation of history. And I think you always have to be a bit careful about that, because if you ask a lot of British people who won the Second World War, they all say, we did. And then you say, what about the Russians? They say, what about the Russians? And you go, well, the Russians lost a lot more people than the British did and all the rest of it, and they were invaded. And so, oh, really? So every nation teaches the history the way they want to hear it. And I believe, I'm talking as a British person here, I think we're just as guilty of that as the Russians are. We just happen not to have used it to recolonize Jamaica or anywhere.
Maybe just we stand back and take two narratives. So the first narrative that was expected and was kind of widely accepted in the West, I think, before this phase of the war started, was that Russia was going, in fact, to have very quick success. So people are now looking back and sort of mocking Putin for his delusions about how quick it was going to be. But I mean, remember, I'm sure you remember very well, I mean, a lot of the talk in the West was, how do we get Zelensky out? How do we form a government in exile? It was all that stuff, and the surprise even when Zelensky said, I don't need transport, I need ammunition, we're staying. Did you share that perception yourself coming up to the invasion? I mean, did you expect Ukrainian resistance to be as profound as it is?
Well, speaking as a military analyst and former general, of course, I am well qualified to say what I expected. And so I have actually, sometimes I hear myself talking and think, what are you on about? So the honest answer is I didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
And I probably would have been more honest if quite a few other people had said that too.
Yeah.
But I suppose I didn't have a clue, but I was pretty amazed by the ingenuity of the Ukrainians, because what I had seen in 2014 was the Ukrainians surrendering, because they had to surrender, because they had very little training. And I could still, oh my God, I could still remember Belbek airfield. The first shot of this war was fired in 2014 in a place called Belbek airfield in Crimea. And obviously it was Ukrainian. And there was an amazing colonel there called Colonel Mamchur. And he refused to surrender the airfield to the Russians who had surrounded it. And we all trotted up there with our cameras. And it was just extraordinary because he led his band of Ukrainian soldiers carrying the Ukrainian flag and carrying the flag under which the Soviet army, in other words, Russians and Ukrainians together, had defended that airfield from the Nazis. So a sign of the friendship between them. And the Russians were in front of the airfield, standing there, and they carried on walking and walking and walking. And then the Russians shot into the air. Bang! And Colonel Mamchur and his column did not stop. They carried on walking, marching, until they got to the line. And then there was a negotiation. But that was the first shot fired in this war. And he came over to us, you know, we spent the whole day there, and it was a long and complicated thing. But basically, it was this disbelief that the Russians, our brothers, would do this. They didn't believe this. But in the end, and they held on for 20 days in that airfield, which is just amazing. And eventually, they negotiated, and the Ukrainian government said, you know, we have to surrender, because they really had nothing. So that was what I had seen then. I'd seen incredible courage and determination, but a lack of, you know, of the armor to defend against a better armed enemy. So yeah, I was surprised, but it was extraordinary how poor the tactics of the Russians were. So, I mean, you may remember, you know, seeing on television, you'd see a column of tanks coming down the road. Well, I mean, even General Hilsum knows that. If you have a column of tanks going down the road, if somebody takes out the front one and takes out the back one, the ones in the middle are stuck. You know, I mean, you could work that out, couldn't you?
Nah.
No. Okay. But the Russians couldn't. But I think that the problem with this is that, so all of that was true, and there's fantastic, you know, memes of Ukrainian soldiers, you know, using their tractors to pull tanks away and so on. But the Russians have learned as well. The Russians are not idiots, and they do have a lot of soldiers, and they have a lot of ammunition. And okay, their equipment isn't as whiz-bang and, you know, wonderful as all the stuff you get from NATO, but it works. And they have no compunction about total war. They have no compunction about civilians. They have no compunction about accuracy and precision. And they have learned from their mistakes. And if you talk to Ukrainian soldiers, I say, you know, what do you think of the enemy? They say it's pretty good. They fight back. They say we're cleverer, we're more mobile, we're more agile, but they're good. And that is what they're facing now.
Yeah, because that was in fact the second narrative, you know, which was almost a lot of the commentary seemed to swing from, oh, you know, Ukraine's going to collapse very quickly, to, oh, Russia's going to collapse very quickly. You know,
it's all wishful thinking. We want this to be over with so we can get on to the next conflict.
Yeah.
You know, jealous we've got such a short attention span.
Yeah.
No, but that's right. And so then you look at, but I think there's, you know, Western policy, I mean, obviously, you know, it's Western policy of arming Ukraine, but there's also a sort of a wishful thinking policy, which is, you know, hoping that Putin is going to collapse. Well, I don't know, you know, Kremlinology, we're trying to read the ruins, we don't know. And obviously things look more fragile now than they did 2 weeks ago before the Prigozhin mutiny. But we don't really understand what happened in that mutiny. You know, we all saw the pictures, right? We all saw Prigozhin's people seemingly being greeted very positively by the people of Rostov-on-Don as they started this mutiny against the Russian government. But then they've been told in the media that the Wagner Group and Prigozhin are marvelous heroes, so they wouldn't necessarily suddenly think, oh, maybe they're not heroes because now they're trying to overthrow the government that previously they supported. I mean, I guess it was as confusing for Russians as it was for us, and maybe for Prigozhin. I was in Ukraine when it happened, and one of my favourite memes that went round was a picture of Prigozhin, who's sort of in his underwear, sitting on a bed, looking very hungover, and saying, God, we got drunk last weekend. Can't remember a thing. I didn't do anything really stupid, did I?
And as you say, we don't know really what's going on in the Kremlin. And we also, the other thing we don't know is what would the consequences of Putin being overthrown be? I mean, Prigozhin, it was some weird moments, wasn't it, where it was almost a sense of Prigozhin as a hero. I mean, this guy is a literal thug. I mean, he went to jail for assaulting a woman in the street and nearly killing her. He's a completely vicious, no obvious moral code of any kind. But there was a moment when everybody was saying, "Oh, it would be great if he overthrows Putin."
Well, the thing was, he told the truth.
Yeah.
He told the truth. He said that this was a war, which it was a war of choice. It didn't need to happen, and the Russian army is not doing well. So I think that was a particular that was a thing.
Let's deal with maybe the most difficult part of this. I think is that I think by and large in the West there's still very, very strong support for Ukraine. But what there is not is any sense of the end game. And the Ukrainian version of the end game is we take back every inch of our territory and we don't stop until we do that.
Yeah.
And what you know better than any of us here from all conflicts tend to radicalize the demands, because when so many people have been killed, when you've had those mothers crying in those graveyards, it gets more and more and more difficult to say, well, actually, there has to be a negotiation, there has to be a compromise. We have to end this in some way which preserves some kind of honor and decency, but is not what we want. What's your sense of what the end game is? And do you get, from being in Ukraine, do you get a sense that most of the Ukrainians you talk to think this is going to end when we get all our territory back?
Well, certainly the Ukrainians I talk to are very unwilling to countenance anything other than every inch of our territory. And when you say, as I have done several times, people, well, okay, I understand that is what would be morally right. However, it's destroyed, it's mined. A lot of the people who still live in that area, and I'm talking about the east here, and I'll talk about Crimea separately, the east here, a lot of the people who've been carrying on living there are pro-Russian. They're old people who are pro-Russian. And they, and maybe this is a natural buffer zone, and maybe you're going to have to get as far as you can in this counteroffensive, and then, to a position of strength to negotiate. But that, you can, the price for giving up territory could be joining of the EU, joining of NATO, and so on. Anyway, nobody wants to hear this, General Diplomat Hilsum's suggestion does not go down well. And part of the reason it doesn't go down well is because the issue of Crimea. So Crimea is still very firmly in Russian hands, and it is it's very important. It's geostrategically important. It's also a really nice place, which I don't think we can say about the Donbass, which is not a particularly nice place. And the Ukrainians find it's very precious and important to them. And I think that is the most difficult thing. And I think the other thing which is difficult is that this idea, which I think that the Americans and other members of NATO had, which is that the Ukrainians would have a successful counteroffensive. In other words, they would take a lot of territory, and then they would be negotiating from a position of relative strength. But because the counteroffensive is going so slowly, because of the mines, and because the Russian army are not idiots, that, I think, is looking more difficult. And then the other thing which is going on is you have the American electoral cycle. And, of course, the Ukrainians are very aware of this, which is that as long as you've got Biden in the White House, then you're going to get support. And they're frustrated because the Americans haven't provided them with F-16s. And that's not unreasonable, because one of the reasons the counteroffensive is going so slowly is because the Ukrainians don't have air cover. And you can't really do this kind of fighting without air cover. But if you had a Trump in the White House, now, a lot of things in this world I'm not going to say would change for the worse And one of the things is Trump's already said it. He said, I'd end that war in 24 hours. And what he means by that is giving the Russians everything they want. Yeah. And so then all bets are off.
Yeah.
So that is one of the real difficulties when we're looking at an end game. We're not just looking at an end game, we're looking at the end of this year, because it's in November next year. And that, I think, is what is really is difficult. And what the great danger is a frozen conflict. You have a conflict where the lines are stuck and Ukraine can't function as a proper country anymore. Yeah. And the Russians aren't going forward, but they're not going backward, and they can mess up Ukraine anytime, particularly if they're still controlling the Black Sea. And everybody loses interest, and there you go, and sorry about that, Ukraine. And that, I think, is the most worrying thing. Yeah. And negotiations, go on, like public inquiries in Ireland, they go on forever.
Journalistically speaking, is that also a worry that Ukraine was obviously the biggest story in the world last year? And at least from what we can see, it remains, it's still getting very, very lavish attention. But I wonder, from your point of view, I mean, do you sense a weariness with the story?
I sense it's very difficult. So, of course, last year it was, the biggest thing. And viewers are really interested, and it's an amazing story, and money is available for it. Now, I fight with my editor every time now because it's expensive. Going to Ukraine is expensive. And there are other stories as well. And there's also, well, what are you going to do this time that you didn't do last time? What's the news story you're going to... I mean, this is the nature of the news, right? News has to be new. And, I can't say to my editor, well, I think it's really important and I would like to go back to such and such a place. And so he said, well, what's the story? What's the news story? What are you going to say that we don't know already? And, that does it becomes difficult. And so, I think it's an issue. It's the stubborn refusal of reality to fit in with a news timetable. It's very unreasonable of reality, don't you think?
And particularly, I wonder also, is it because you do have, in the West particularly, the creation of these narratives, the latest one being the counteroffensive, which was going to be a great success, was going to move at a particular kind of timetable. And even with my complete lack of military knowledge, I mean, it wasn't just obvious that the defenders, for example, have the advantage, which the Ukrainians enjoyed first, and then very obviously, the Russians have had plenty of time to lay this immense amount of mines, and I don't think I've never come across any historical example of a successful counteroffensive where you do not have at least parity in the air, at the very least parity. So it seemed obvious this was going to be extremely difficult and slow. But it's not just the news cycle that has to create this drama. It's also the political narrative has to create this drama, doesn't it?
Well, particularly if taxpayers are paying for this weaponry to go to Ukraine. So for the politicians as well, and I support that. I think that we should be backing Ukraine. I'm in agreement with that. But we are talking about enormous amounts of money, and then if you're talking about air cover, then there's even more money, and so on. So it's very difficult. And politicians can't do that if the narrative is that it's not really going to work. But I also think that, and I think I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, of not. It's hard to be Cassandra all the time, and even journalists, have this human, hope. Every now and then you have a little hope in this world, but then it gets crushed. So, but I do think that it can warp your judgment. Maybe it warped our judgment.
How do you avoid your own judgment being warped?
Warped. I would say I veer like a supermarket trolley, between despair and hope. So, never managed to go straight. Look, it's very difficult. One is a human being. I think that part of what you have to do is you do have to do this thing of stepping back, and you do also have to, look at your own experience, and you do have to read a bit of history. I mean, I have been reading quite a bit of Ukrainian history. And then sometimes I try and read military history, and then I get a bit lost. And you talk to people who know more about this stuff than you do, and you try and put all of that in together. But it is quite complicated to do the two things at the same time, which is one is to show the mood and the feeling on the ground. Part of my job is to talk to Ukrainian soldiers, about what's going on, and to reflect what they feel and think, as well as to stand back and try and say how I assess this, realistically. And inevitably, sometimes you're going to get that wrong. And sometimes you're not going to know if you're wrong or right for many years, which is one of the great advantages of television, because people very rarely look back and say, she got that wrong then, didn't she? So I try not to predict too much. I try and analyze and reflect what's happening and not predict too much because, I'm so often wrong.
Yeah.
We all are.
Do you, because you've been covering conflicts for a very long time, and they're all horrific. I mean, of their nature. I mean, you go back to to Rwanda. Do you lose faith in the value of the storytelling sometimes?
Sometimes. I mean, I think that. I mean, I do go through phases when I think, oh, God, all these stories I've done, it's never made the slightest bit of difference, and so on. And then you have to go back to, but, light is better than darkness. Truth is better than lies. You have to believe in the story for its own sake and for the sake of information. And I do believe that. I do believe that it is important that people should know and understand, and that I should do my best. But I don't, this phrase, make a difference. As an individual journalist, you very, very rarely make a difference. You can be part of something which changes the conversation, or which provides information that, feeds into policy or into public opinion. But you are very unlikely as an individual journalist to make a difference in that way. But I think there's also a sort of deeper thing about when you do the kind of work that I do. So, for example, one of the things I'm very exercised at the moment about is Sudan. And I'm very exercised about what's happening in Darfur, because in the early 2000s, I was in Darfur and I witnessed some of what happened there, which was a genocide, and it's happening again. But at the same time, there's this bit of me who's like, I can't face going back. Now, one of the things which I'm lucky, I work for Channel 4 News, which has, other correspondents, and my colleague Porrick O'Brien and brilliant producer we have called Zara Wasame have just been in Chad, and they have been collecting the stories of people fleeing Darfur for Chad. And they have managed, the last story they did was they forensically put together the story of a massacre in a place called Mr. A, which is just across the border from Chad in Darfur. And I looked at that, and I was, this is just my personal reaction, so you go through all these things. Part of me is like, oh, I should be doing that story. That's my story. I knew about that before anybody else. And I'm like, shut up, Lindsey. All that matters is that the story gets done. And it is all that matters is the story gets done. And then the other bit of me is, maybe he did it better because he was newly outraged.
Yeah.
And he saw this, he didn't do it last time it happened. So he looks at this and he is horrified. Whereas a bit of me would want to sit on the ground and cry to see it again. So you need new journalists. So you need that mixture of new journalists, young journalists, as well as old farts like me, who've seen it before and therefore maybe have more understanding. But that isn't always what you need.
Yeah. How do you sustain for yourself? I mentioned this at the introduction. That you have this extraordinary ability to be dispassionate, to retain your journalistic objectivity, to try to stand outside and not make yourself the story.
Oh, yeah.
Some of your colleagues can sometimes make themselves the story.
Really?
Shall we say. And you don't do that. And I think that's one of the things that people admire so deeply about you. And yet you're a human being. You're you're also trying to tell us these human stories. We have to connect. We have to have emotion. And I just wonder how you manage that. You know, how you deal with not sitting down on the ground and crying, not becoming so angry that you can't see what's in front of you or deal with it in that dispassionate way anymore. I mean, is that something you just learn to do over time, or is it the same struggle each time you go out?
No, I think you do learn how to do it over time. I think I'm also lucky that I work in a team. In television, you always work in a team, and so I usually work with a producer who. And the producers are quite good at sort of saying, bit OTT, maybe? I'm like, no, it's absolutely right. Oh, all right. So, you know, it does help to have a team which may temper your worst, you know, instincts or whatever. But to be honest, I sort of don't know. I just do what I do, and I have no idea whether it's any good or not. And sometimes I look back and I think, oh, that was a bit shy. And other times I look and go, oh, that wasn't bad. But I sort of don't quite know what I do. I just do it. I'm there. One of the things that I mean, and everybody's different. You know, as a TV journalist, like if I'm doing a piece to camera, I never write it down. I always just say something. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. But I kind of talk. And that, I think, is something you can learn to do over time. Because you're trying to say, what I'm always thinking is, if I was going to call my friend Rosemary up there, if she said, what's it like? This is what I would tell her. I would tell her this. And that's what I say. And so I think, and I wouldn't, you know, ring and just cry and say, this is awful. I'd try and explain something.
Yeah.
I'd try and reflect something of what's going on. So that's what I'm trying to do in a piece.
You do, it's extraordinary. Great. Well, let's see if we've got a couple of questions that I'm sure people would love to put to you. There's a gentleman here first. Do we have a mic, or are we? Yes. So, yeah, I was coming in. If you just hang on for the mic, please, and if you would frame your statements in the form of a question, it would be extremely useful for us.
Oh no, go on, rant.
Sorry. I share your kind of lack of optimism about a settlement in this, and I would argue that NATO membership could be the biggest stumbling block ahead of territory or anything else. Two quick questions. Do you think we'd be in this position if Ukraine had been given everything it wanted in the first place a year ago, including fighter planes? And the second thing is a more broad question. You know, it's often been said that the post-war 20th century was the rise of democracies worldwide. The story of the 20th century so far has been a retreat of democracy. And what we're seeing now is that defending democracy is not going to be pretty. And forgive me, Fintan, I read your article on cluster bombs, but I think we might ask ourselves whether we can afford to take the moral high ground when the defense of democracy is going to be ugly. You know, we've seen that authoritarians are incredible at sidling up to each other. I mean, Netanyahu and Putin, you couldn't make that up, you know. Democracies are very bad at actually responding, and it's not going to be pretty. And do you think the West and democracies need to face up to that?
Great, let's put those two questions.
That's a good question. Yeah. I might leave that one to you, the second one. The democracy one, because I find it really difficult because the problem is that if, you know, if we think of democracy as a good thing, if you do incredibly ugly things to defend democracy, you become ugly. You become that thing you're trying to fight. But I totally buy your point that this can't be pure. And so I don't think that, you know, I don't think that supplying all of the weaponry that Ukraine wanted right at the beginning would have been the answer. Because it's more complicated than that in how you train and how you learn and how much an army can absorb and all of that. I do think that the air power earlier would have made a difference, or could have made a difference. And I understand the Ukrainians' frustration there. But, you know, it's always the problem of where do you begin with the problem. So you can look back, and actually a lot of the training which was done after 2014 by NATO of Ukrainian forces is what helped enable them to stave off the worst right at the beginning. So that was that was really good. But then you can look back at all of the mistakes that were made at the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm not a person who thinks that NATO shouldn't have expanded, but I do, you know, and here again, we're talking about democracy, because at the fall of the Soviet Union, we imposed two contradictory things on Russia. One was you have to have this fast track kind of capitalism, which involved theft and oligarchs, because this shock therapy is the right thing for you to become a capitalist state. And on the other hand, you've got to have democracy. But nobody would have voted for that.
Yeah.
So we had this totally contradictory policy. And then, once Russia had become this kleptocratic, corrupt state, we thought, oh, that's nice, let's have some of that. And so, you know, in London, we became Londongrad, and we, you know, all of the fancy houses and all the banking and the lawyers and so on. So we benefited, and so therefore Putin and co said, well, they'll do anything for money, and he was right. Yep. So I find it very difficult, you know, it's a sort of long-winded answer to your question, but I don't quite know where to go back to look to the start of everything that was done wrong. So I find it a bit hard to say, you know, yes, it would have been all right if only we'd done that.
Great answer. There's a gentleman here, and then for the next one, if anybody up there, particularly if they're female, wants to ask a question.
Why are there no women asking questions? What's wrong with you?
There's the gentleman in the second row here had his hand up first, I think. I think this gentleman had his hand up first here. Yeah, thank you.
Lindsey, I realise you report from Ukraine, but have you any feeling for what the ordinary Joe Soap, as we refer to him in Ireland, in Russia, feels about the situation?
No, and I wish I did. And that's one of the biggest frustrations, because I don't think that our reporting of this war is biased, but I do think it's incomplete.
Yeah.
And that is because we can't get exactly that. And we know that there's a massive amount of propaganda, and that Russian public opinion is very dependent on television, and the television is very powerful propaganda. But I would expect that in Russia, as in anywhere else where people are educated, there'll be a mix of opinions. But what that proportion of mix is, I think we have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, right up at the back there, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, is there a possibility that Russia would actually destroy itself from the inside? I mean, there's hardly a week that goes by now when we don't hear of a general that is going missing or whatever, and don't hear anything from him. And therefore, Ukraine will actually fade out of the headlines. Is that a distinct possibility, do you think?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I think that the crumbling of the Russian system from within, and, you know, obviously the Prigozhin mutiny is part of that. And then we've seen in the last 2 days, there's a particularly, the leader of I think they're called the Angry Men of the Patriots. Anyway, they're sort of to the right of Putin, Strelkin. He's been arrested. A couple of generals, as you say, have sort of disappeared and been arrested. So there's all of this stuff going on. And it's a bit of a black box. And so we can be surprised at any time if there is a collapse of the system. But I think the one thing we do know is that if the system collapses, or if Putin loses power for whatever reason, it's not going to be some nice, shiny, liberal Democrat who's going to come, sort of wandering out of some Moscow suburb and take over. It's going to be something vociferous, fragmented, dark, difficult. And so what the implications of that would be, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's, as Donald Rumsfeld said, there are many unknown unknowns here.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder, would you agree? I've been told by somebody who spent 7 years in Ukraine, just right up to the start of the war. He was very, very suspect and cynical of the American part pre-war and leading up to the war. We commonly are told and believe, and the press tells us that Putin is the aggressor, let's say. But he would say that, and my question is, that it goes back to the Americans and the failure to adhere to the Western side of the Minsk agreement. Mm-hmm. That was a fundamental part of what pushed Putin into a corner where he had only one way to go? That's the first question. And the second question, I've also been told in more recent times that the American, large corporations in America, the Monsantos and all these type of companies, have been acquiring in Ukraine since the war started significant parts of the Ukrainian rich agricultural resources. So they apparently, the figure I've heard is 23% of Ukrainian natural resources. The American corporations have acquired rights for the future going forward. And just as we were told in the Middle East, so many wars about oil, we're told that, don't dismiss this. And that is a factor. I wonder, would you agree with both of those?
I think that anti-Americanism is a poor lens through which to view this war. I think that I do not believe that Monsanto and these companies have bought up 23% of Ukraine's rich and now landmine-ridden agricultural potential, because it would be not a very clever thing to do. And I also don't think that the Ukrainians would allow that. So I have not seen any evidence of that, and I haven't heard that before. I think it's unlikely. So no, I don't agree with you there. And I think that American policy is often venal. I think it is always self-interested. But I do not think that they invaded a sovereign country. I think that Russia invaded a sovereign country, which was called Ukraine. And I think that is what it's about.
Would any woman like to ask the last question? Yes, please, thank you. Just in the, there, thank you.
Lindsey, I've been following you for many years, and I'm an admirer of your work. But just what you said there, Russia's wrong to invade, we know this, but the Americans called it a preemptive strike. And shouldn't some credence be given to the Russians' worry of a build-up on their eastern flank? I mean, it's been going...
What build-up on the eastern flank? You mean the two...
Well, you've got Lithuania's and all of the countries.
There was a build-up in the Lithuania? They're members of NATO, so
yes,
there were NATO... There were NATO exercises there, yes.
Yes, indeed. But
well, what do you think that was going to do? Invade Russia?
But why was there a military build-up there?
Because there have been Russian threats since the invasion of Ukraine since 2014.
And there was a history there before 2014. Aside from that, but my one thing is, Putin wouldn't have too much of a problem persuading his population that the West was, against them. When you consider the cultural and sporting, I think returning the Paralympian Chinese athletes from China was a very cruel thing to do and inhumane. And why wouldn't the Russians feel threatened by the West?
I think that you're right in the sense that I think that there is a lot of anti-Western feeling in Russia. And I think that, I certainly would think that a sort of the détente era, in a sense, was the best era. But I can't agree that I think that there was any kind of NATO threat to Russia, because I really don't think there was. And I think that it is I think the Russian government wants to pitch this as a war between the West or NATO and Russia. I don't actually think that that is what it is.
Sorry, we can't get into a debate. It's not, it's not fair.
But I buy your point. I understand your point.
There's one last question. Thank you.
Yes.
I don't know what proportion of the Ukrainian population is currently outside Ukraine, but it's a relatively high proportion. And a high proportion of them are women and young people.
Yes.
I don't know how much you've been able to talk with them either in the UK or in the rest of Western Europe, and what their feelings are about the situation as it is now, whether they will actually really want to go back to Ukraine, or whether they are settling now in the rest of Western Europe and almost becoming non-Ukrainian, or whether there is still that passion to be Ukrainian when they're in the West.
Well, I mean, it's a question you should ask your Ukrainian neighbors, of course. But I think that a lot of people will want to go back, and some people are already going back. And I've certainly met in Kyiv Of course, in Kyiv and Lviv and these cities, they're still dangerous in the sense that you've got cruise missiles and armed drones coming in. But because of the air defenses, which have improved tremendously, it's not as dangerous as it was at the beginning. And certainly, I know people who go backwards and forwards, and people who've decided to move back. And I do think that there is a huge sort of patriotic feeling which extends to many Ukrainians who I have met, certainly in the UK. But obviously, when people leave their countries, and certainly you have kids, and so, your kids go to, I know a Ukrainian woman whose little boy is going to school in Oxfordshire. Well, he speaks better, he's 7, and he now speaks English better than his mum, and he's growing up like a little English boy. And so that, becomes, as with refugees always, it becomes complicated, doesn't it? And for the younger generation may grow up feeling divided about whether they're Ukrainian or from the country in which they are. But most of the Ukrainians I know who are adults do want to go back and feel themselves very strongly Ukrainian.
And hopefully there will be a time when they get the opportunity to go back to a country that is being rebuilt.
We hope so.
The first question, I think, was a very good one, which is about whether the defense of democracy is a dirty business, and of course it is. But it cannot be a business that gets so dirty that the mud becomes indistinguishable on both sides. And it was Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, who said, "Never wrestle with the pig because you get dirty and the pig likes it."
Yes, it's very good.
And it's really important to remember that, in terms of this whole struggle for democracy, that we should not get down on the same level and wrestle with pigs, And one of the critical differences, as Lindsey so eloquently said, is that we can have this discussion. We can talk about these things. We can be informed. We can be informed by someone whom we have built up over many years, at least in our own minds, a relationship with, a relationship of trust. I think we're all here to listen to Lindsey because we honor her integrity. We honor her courage. We honor her honesty. We honor her when she says, I don't know the answers. She's not filling us with propaganda. She's not filling us with rhetoric. She's giving us details of people's lives as they are being led. That is democracy. Democracy is not just going out to vote. Right? It's being in a position to be able to communicate that information and to receive that information and to form our own opinions. And there are obviously different opinions, but to form our own opinions on the basis of that. If we lose that, then the fight's over. And one of the things that fills me with hope is that so long as there's Lindsey and her colleagues and so many people who are doing this work, that fight will not be over. It's been an absolute pleasure and joy to be with you over the last hour, and I'm sure everybody is really.
Thank you very much.